Welcome to the first theme of the What is Politics aspect of the module, and essentially we're going to introduce this topic by talking about why politics matters. In this short presentation, you'll get some insights into why politics matters, why this is a discipline which is part of the social sciences, why should we care about the study of politics. What we're going to do before that though is I'll give you a kind of quick overview of what's happening with the module. So you'll know that the broad theme of the module is around democratic politics, the principles of democratic politics, institutions, political institutions, and the practice of politics. And we're largely focused on the UK, British environment when we're talking about this module, although we can bring in examples from other countries and state contexts. And essentially what the module does is offer different topics around this theme of democracy in the UK. So later in the module you'll have more inputs on things like political ideologies, you'll have inputs on things like the state, the executive, the bureaucracy. You'll also look at issues to do with voting behaviour. You'll also get to look at issues to do with public policy and Brexit and Britain's relationship with the EU. But this particular input that I'm offering at the moment is to kind of think about the basics, start from a solid grounding, because before we get to some of these bigger issues and broader issues in political studies, it's good to understand what politics is all about. So this is what we're really aiming to do. Of course, the lectures, these online recorded lectures, will be supported by seminars later in the module programme. And if you look at the module guide, you'll see the lecture timetable, but you'll also see the seminar timetable as well. But obviously get in touch with the course team if you have any questions about the module. Of course, there's two assessments as well. One of them is a multiple choice quiz, and the other is an essay down the line. But again, you'll get more information about that. But it's just good to demonstrate that this dimension of the module is to get us just warmed up, if you like, to understand political studies. Okay, so if you think about these themes or these images that are on the slide, to you personally, have a think about what these pictures, what these images conjure up for you. So there's an image of Brexit, there's one about the independence referendum, no versus yes. There's also a boat there which is full of refugees and migrants, obviously trying to cross the border, and it's to represent what's happening just now in terms of the migration crisis. But then we've also got an image of COVID-19. I wonder what these images conjure up for you in different ways. You could argue that the Brexit and the no yes independence referendum images, perhaps they conjure up something to do with elections, referenda, different positions, different political positions, perhaps even conflict. These are two entrenched and challenging issues, and I think we're still feeling the effects of them just now. And obviously politics is a process, so the issues around Brexit and the potential for another independence referendum are ever present. So what do these feel like to you? Does it make you feel a sense of uncertainty? Does it frustrate you? Does it encourage you? Does it make you feel quite passionate about certain issues? What about the migration crisis? Does it hit you at an emotional level? Is there a moral issue around this? Is there a key public policy challenge in terms of having to deal and how to manage such difficult issues? How do we do that? How do we go about it? The COVID-19 issue is something that affects all of us in this country and beyond, our families, our way of life, how we're delivering this teaching right now as a result of the COVID crisis. What has that crisis done for the country? What have been the policy decisions made by government that you agree with, that you disagree with? How is it possible to get things right during an uncertain time? Can you satisfy everyone? Is it possible to do things effectively all of the time? Is it possible to control a virus without hiccup? There are questions around all of these images. But one of the things that joins them together is politics in different ways and in different contexts. We all, throughout all of these images, think about government. We think about the actions of government. We think about decisions that are made. We think about the impact of the decisions that are made on our lives and on our society and communities. Do these different issues lead to inequalities for certain groups? Are there certain communities that are more vulnerable as a result of what we're seeing here? Quite possibly. Politics, therefore, is about trying to think those things through, coming to solutions, trying to understand the different positions, how we might actually wrestle with some of the options about how to make things better in the future. And a lot of that comes down to leadership, political leadership. And it also comes down to how we influence political leaders as well. Often in politics you'll hear this term political actor. Political actor. And we're not talking about a thespian, we're talking about an individual, group, agent who has a stake in politics. So when I talk about an actor, or you read about the word actor in politics, what that means is an individual, institution, organisation that has a stake in the political process. In some ways we're political actors if we're engaged in politics. Politicians are obviously political actors. Pressure groups can be political actors. In what ways do political actors have a relationship with these different issues that are on the slide? That's something for you to think about. But one of the things that is interesting for us as students of politics is to understand decision making. So if politics is about decision making over the allocation of scarce resources in society, then there's reasons why we study politics. It's a basic law of economics that the economy is such and resources are such that there's a scarcity of resources. If that's a truth, and if we know that resources are scarce, then politics is about how we allocate those scarce resources. So we study politics because politics affects the fabric of lives, our communities and wider society. We seek to understand the role of the state, including its power, legitimacy and authority. So when we're thinking about power, how does it execute power? How does the state accumulate power? The government is part of the state. So therefore, how does the government come to be? Is it through democratic processes? What do those democratic processes look like? And what kind of mandate does that give the government to make decisions? How do we influence power? Students of politics will be interested in those types of questions. Also be interested in legitimacy. Because if we're going to legitimise decision making, legitimise the government's decision making, then there's questions around how we ensure that we give legitimacy to government. And often that comes through electoral processes, voting for your local member of parliament, and the party who wins the most seats in parliament will become the government of the day. In some ways we legitimate through our electoral process the government of the day. But legitimacy is more than that. Legitimacy might also be about the extent to which the public accept what's being offered to them at any given time. You might be aware of some of the recent issues and decisions around the potential for a second wave of the coronavirus, and the government are now talking about trying to avoid a national lockdown. And some of the narrative around that is around whether or not a national lockdown would be seen as acceptable to the public. The first wave, which led to a national lockdown, it seemed that the public generally accepted the rationale for it. But to what extent does tolerance levels of the public reduce over time? These issues around legitimacy and balancing legitimacy with what the public see as acceptable and what is possible are tricky balancing acts for government and authority. To what extent is the authority of government there? Do you respect the authority? Do you give authority to the state and to the government within the state? How does that happen? Does the government have to build trust with the public? How does that happen? So these are the types of questions we're interested in. We also want to understand democracy. Now, democracy is something you'll learn a little bit more about later in the module. But how is it actually executed? How does democracy happen? And what's its limitations? So that might be around how the elections work, the voting system, the effectiveness of different types of voting systems. But it might be more than that. It might be about how the public have a role in policy decision making. Does the government open up the corridors of power to wider stakeholder organisations and groups to help them inform policy? That's a democratic process. What's the best way to open up the corridors of government power to wider stakeholders? How do you do that? What are the best ways of doing that? So understanding democratic processes, not just in terms of elections, but in terms of how policy decision making by government works, is an interesting area for those studying politics. We also want to know what it means to be a citizen, this idea of citizenship. How does the government ensure that we are active citizens? What does it mean to be a citizen? What's our relationship to the state? Is it a positive one? Is it a critical one? How do we ensure that everyone's included in that process? Because we do know that there are chronic inequalities within society. And how do we know and how do we ensure that we don't leave out the vulnerable? What does it mean to be an active citizen? So understanding the patterns of inequality, understanding what it means to be a citizen, and what are the outcomes of that, is important in the study of politics. We might want to know about how to be an active political actor. In this day and age, we're not short of opportunities in many ways to try and become an active political actor, be it through social media activity, it might be through pressure group membership, it might be through protest, it might be through standing for elections, your local elections as a councillor, or even within national elections. It could be about being a member of a political party, it could be about canvassing. We might want to know about the ways in to politics. We might want to know about the ways to best influence the political terrain and what it means to be an active political actor. Understanding how and why decisions are made. Myself, as a Professor of Public Policy, this is probably the area that I'm most focused on, although understanding how and why decisions are made relate to a number of different other bullet points on this slide. As a policy analyst, what I like to do is try to understand the motivations behind policy. What is the evidence that has went into policy decision making? Indeed, are decisions based on evidence at all? I'm very interested in how governments respond to crisis situations. I'm also interested in how the institutions of government reform and change over time. How does that happen? How can we understand decision making and the motivations of government? And that's not always straightforward, because when we talk about the government, we're not talking about something that's easily identifiable and sits within a vacuum, because policy relationships around government saturate the political processes. Because if we are looking at decision making by the Scottish Government, it might be that decisions of the Scottish Government might be influenced by the UK Government, or it might be influenced by the European Union and beyond. So understanding where decision making power sits, how that's influenced and who has influenced it at different levels of governance, is something that is a complex issue, but nonetheless it's an important issue. Because if we want to understand government, if we want to understand how things work, we have to be prepared to get into some of those complexities. So that's some of the reasons why we study politics. Politics, the state and sovereign power. So studying politics requires us to consider the who of power. Who is it that exercises various kinds of power over us? Okay, so who's doing it? Who's influencing the government to make decisions? Who is setting the agenda? Is it always the government, or can it be multinational corporations? Can it be large, powerful capitalist organisations? Power is present through all society, and we know that power is executed and implemented by different institutions and people. But the study of politics concerns itself with major institutions where power is concentrated. So the state, for example. The state is another concept that can be defined in various ways. But in its broadest sense, the state can be understood as those institutions that are recognisably public, and they are responsible for the collective organisation of communal life and are funded at the public's expense. The state comprises of various institutions of government: the bureaucracy, the military, police courts, social security system, and so on. So that's taken from Haywood, 2015. And that's right, because when we think about politics, we generally think about these big institutions that are often public funded. The bureaucracy is another word for the civil service, so the British civil service, which is basically the implementer of government decision makings. It's known as the machinery of the state. The government is what's made up of the elected politicians that form the government and who have a political agenda based on a manifesto at an election. And essentially the government is there to organise the state in many ways, and the bureaucracy is there to help implement government policy. And of course we have military, police courts, social security system, wider public sector bodies that deliver public services. The state has some features. So the defining features of the state: a unified set of institutions. There's a controlling element in that the state can be recognised as something that controls a territory, that offers a distinct society. So the British state will be different from, say, the Spanish state. Making and enforcing collectively binding decisions. Of course, in order to maintain some kind of social order, there has to be the making and enforcing of collectively binding decisions. But that collectively binding issue talks to us in a way around this issue around legitimacy, ensuring the collective binding decision, ensuring that people adopt and implement policies through their everyday actions. Monopolising the legitimate use of force. Of course, the state can be a force for intervention. We know that in terms of military action and so on. Seeking sovereignty. So the state will often want to maintain its sovereignty. Sovereignty basically means the ability to govern, the ability to have the power, the ability to control. And of course this was a big narrative around the Brexit issue. So those that were in favour of coming out of the European Union were saying that the British state was losing its sovereignty over time and we had to take back control. Whether or not you agree with that or not is a different matter. The narrative was there in terms of seeking sovereignty for the state. Now the question often is, within a globalised world, Brexit or no Brexit, the argument could be that most states, or all states, have compromised their sovereignty to a degree to be participants within globalisation. Because to be participants in globalisation, you have to bargain and compromise with different international bodies, you have to be part of a global market, therefore you have to be prepared to give up some control to be part of a global environment, Brexit or no Brexit. The state operates in a distinct public realm, so we identify with the public realm around the state in terms of these public institutions that we've just referred to. And the state often decides what makes a citizen and how to get into the country, how to maintain borders. What does it mean to be a British citizen, for example? Other characteristics. The state can be there to advance common interests. The state is accepted generally as legitimate by significant groups, and that might mean pressure groups, could mean universities, might be business. Has a bureaucracy and a tax system, of course. We have a civil service, a tax-based system to raise revenue for the country. Operates within a constitution and legal system. Of course, there's different types of constitution. So some countries have a written, codified constitution. So in the US, for example, we have a written constitution that's codified. Whereas in Britain, we have a looser arrangement whereby our constitution is known as uncodified. Strictly speaking, it is written down in different aspects because acts of parliament are written down and they dictate how the state operates. Therefore, there is an element of a written nature to the British Constitution, but it's uncodified. It's not all in one place. You can't pick up one document and say that's the British Constitution, because it's made up of not just the little bits that are written within acts of parliament, but also custom and practice and culture and legacy. That's the way of doing things. So we have a very distinct constitutional arrangement, but it's very British in that sense. It's flexible and uncodified. And the state is recognised as a state by other states. So it's recognised as a legitimate territory by other countries. So there are big questions, and these are questions that you should be pondering when you're undertaking your reading, or you're thinking about politics, you're engaging with the television, on television news or social media news. Have these questions in your mind. On any given situation, who has the power? How can we assess the effectiveness of the state? So, what makes a good state? What makes it effective? Is it around being transparent? Is it around taking an evidence-based approach to policy making? Is it around being inclusive, democratic? Are all these things hallmarks of effectiveness? What do you think makes for an effective state? We also have to bear in mind the relationship between politics and economics. The economic system will be fundamental to how politics works. In a capitalist free market economy, political decisions will often be a reflection of that economy and that economic system. If we are looking at more of a Keynesian, state-led form of economics, the state will organise politics in such a way whereby decisions are made differently. So, for example, if we live in a system of free market economics, policy decisions will often be made based on the idea that we should have free enterprise, a mixed economy, and not having too much of an interventionist state. On the other hand, if you're looking at a system that's more Keynesian, and we've obviously had more of that in the post-war years, but obviously now we've moved away further from that, is this idea of state intervention. So after the Second World War, the idea was we needed to build a welfare state, and the state had to take more of a role in society. as time went on, and as we had a situation with the rise of Thatcherism and new right economics, the role of the state changed. It reduced over time, and private enterprise was accepted more generally. But those economic questions will feature in how political decisions are made and what decisions are made. So, is it the case that we can afford another national lockdown in the country around COVID? What are the limits of the economy, which will therefore impact on political decision making? These are big questions. How can we account for the wider forces of globalisation, Europeanisation, or even de-Europeanisation, as well as localism? What this highlights is a complexity. So, in the British state, we're having to deal with the fact that we are participants within globalisation. We've also been members of the European Union, so we've had to accommodate policy relationships at a higher level than us, although that's changing as a result of Brexit. Therefore, the term de-Europeanisation is becoming more common, how we untangle from the EU, because over time we have been very much intertwined with European decision making for vast areas of our public policies, ranging from agriculture to issues around the environment and so on, as well as localism. So there are increasing demands by governments in Scotland and UK level to encourage local decision making and localism at the same time as being participants within globalisation and so on. So this really tells us something. This tells us that the landscape can be quite complicated and that policy relationships are intertwined. However, the degree of the level of connection and the degree to which they're intertwined depends on the policy area. So there are some policy areas that aren't so intertwined. So for instance, issues around trade are of course much more associated with globalisation, technology, trade and the interconnection of technology and so on is very much a global thing, if you like. But then issues around the armed forces, defence policy, you can't compare them in the same way. There might be elements of that are globalised, but you can't say that they're the same as, for example, trade. So we have to be quite careful as to the context in which we're working in to understand the different policy relationships that surround them. And also, a big question is, can politics solve wicked problems? Issues to do with inequalities, climate change, pandemics, poverty. Is it possible for politics to solve these things? Have we been very successful at them up till now? We see real challenges with chronic inequalities that seem to be rising and widening. Climate change, pandemics, poverty. What have we actually learned? Is politics something that can help to solve these problems? Or is it that it's actually not politicians that are best served to solve these problems, but other types of political actors? Those on the outside, those calling for change. It's a big question and something to ponder over. Okay, so that's the end of the first theme. The next theme we're going to look at is what is politics? And we'll look at that from more of a definitional point of view, some key themes and issues. Thanks very much.